Think about what Martin Luther King in his famous speech said when he said, "I have a dream." And he paused. 250,000 people waited in anticipation of Dr. King, tell us what the dream is. All he did was pause.
Hi, welcome to the Tarun Stevenson Leadership Channel. I'm your host, Tarun Stevenson, and we are all about helping you lead, communicate, and grow to your full potential. Whether you're tuning in on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, or your favorite podcasting app, don't forget to subscribe and follow so that you can stay up to date with all our latest episodes. All right, here's the latest episode. Let's get into it. Well, hi everybody. I'm here today with Bart Queen all the way from North Carolina in the US, and Bart is a communications expert. He's got over 27 years in helping people to develop their skills as communicators and find their voice. Welcome, Bart. So good to have you on the show.
Well, thank you, Tarun. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you and your listeners. Thank you.
But I'm really excited about talking with you today because we had a chance to talk on the phone a few days ago before recording, and just our initial conversation was just wonderful. I really enjoyed getting to know you, and I'm really excited about what you're going to share with us today. Why don't you just tell our listeners a little bit about you and what you do? I know you're an international traveler with training and in speaking. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your organization?
Sure. Well, I'm one of those, Tarun, very lucky people who've had the privilege of their work being their passion and their purpose. So really for me, for the last 30 years, my whole focus has been on giving people their voice. Anyone from an entrepreneur to a salesperson to an executive to a marketing person, and now doing a fair amount of work out within the faith community.
Right.
My corporate work, sir, really gives me an opportunity then to give to nonprofits, women's groups, or children's groups. So I've just been lucky enough for my life to be in kind of one path where it's been my joy, my purpose, and my work.
Wow, fantastic. And I forget who said it, but there's a quote that I love: the harder I work, the luckier I get. And I suspect that it hasn't all been luck, but there's been a lot of hard work along the way. Why don't you tell us about how you got started in communication? What's your personal journey of how you really developed an interest in becoming a communicator?
You know, my story is very much like other people's story, where out of the pain comes their passion. I'm an example of that.
Yeah.
When I was 16 years old, I was doing kind of a competition for an award. And it was the classic thing where you reach into the box, pull out a topic, talk for 2 or 3 minutes, and then sit back down.
Right.
Well, I reached into the hat, I pulled out my topic. I said the same sentence 3 times.
Oh, right.
And I could feel myself just going, oh my gosh, I have already failed in front of these 150 people.
Yeah.
I stopped, I said, thank you. And when I went to walk off the stage, this will give my age away, sir. It was the days when microphones were still on a cord.
Okay.
I tripped over the cord and landed flat on my face in front of these 150 people.
Oh, my.
I swore I would never, ever do anything like this again.
Yeah.
And now, 45 years later, that's all I've done with my whole life is help people overcome those fears.
Wow. So you were 16, you had an opportunity to speak. It was somewhat of a disaster, your first experience. What was the catalyst that pushed you beyond that moment to actually start developing your ability to speak and even wanting to do it again after such a difficult first experience?
In my junior year in school, I had an opportunity to go overseas for the very first time. I spent 6 months in Pakistan in 1979. That experience changed my life.
Wow.
Having grown up in a very small, kind of sheltered farming community, and all of a sudden seeing the world on a bigger scale was life changing for me. The following summer, I got asked to be a training director at a college camp. That put me in a position where, again, I had to get up in front of folks and begin to teach and share. And part of that was based on my experience of being in Pakistan.
Wow. Okay.
I fell in love with being able to see people inspired, being able to see them grow and take principles that they could repeat.
Yeah.
That experience then launched me into really pursuing that more kind of as a career.
Did you have any
So
formal training in that, or was it just opportunities that presented themselves along the way?
Really more the school of kind of hard knocks and trying different things
Yeah.
and learning different things. And for me, sir, it was, if you read a communication book or a presentation book, for example, it will say things like, look at your audience. Don't say and on. But they don't teach you how to do those things.
Yeah.
And for me, I needed it simple and I needed it repeatable. So I began to study and try to find the principles that would allow, if I could do it over and over again, how could I help you do it over and over again? And if you can understand that repeatability factor, in my mind, then you understand how to get muscle memory.
Yeah.
And if you get muscle memory, then it doesn't matter whether you're in front of a boardroom table, you're doing a TED Talk, you're doing a keynote speech, you're doing a one-on-one, or we're doing something like this, Tarun. You just know you have the confidence if I'm executing on that skill set.
Yeah.
And seeing people come to life when that happens just inspires me over and over and over again.
Yeah, absolutely.
I will never forget working with a group of young people, high school students in rural California, right along the California coastline, most of them being children of migrant farm workers coming in and working the fields in California.
Yeah.
This young lady, when she got up to do her first initial piece with us, Hispanic young lady, she said, every day my parents tell me that I'm ugly. And the tears just started to come down her face, and the tears came down our face as she shared this story. She went through our full 3-day youth program. And at the very end, sir, I did something I've never, ever done before. Normally with a young person, I would say you're confident, say you're confident. And I would get them to practice eye contact, a short to a medium sentence, the power of the pause. But with her, I said, Guadalupe, I need you to say you're beautiful. And she put her head down and looked at the floor, and she almost whispered it, sir. She said, I'm beautiful. And I said, Guadalupe, I can't hear you. Say it louder. Say it louder. Say it louder. And eventually her head came up and her shoulders came back. And now she's looking at all her fellow students going, I am beautiful. I am beautiful. I am beautiful. And now we have tears in our eyes just from this transformation that she has gone through.
Wow.
That's the kind of thing that has caused me to do this over and over again, no matter what age we are, because you get your confidence when you realize you found your voice.
Yeah, and I think you touch on something there that is so crucial, no matter whether you're doing this as a profession or just you're just going through life and having to communicate with your coworkers or your family, is that the things that have been said to you can have a profound impact on the way you perceive yourself and your ability to do things. I remember in my 20s, I was a recording artist and I toured as a singer and a songwriter. And even when I was, if you like, semi-successful in that industry, I had a intense anxiety about going out on stage, and always struggled to play my songs in front of small groups. A friend said to me, play me one of your songs. I couldn't do it. Put me on a stage, I was fine. And I remember talking to a therapist probably about 10 years ago, and I was trying to figure out, what these hang-ups were. And he said, what's the first time you remember being embarrassed at your music? And I remember being 6 or 7 years old in primary school, and I wrote this little tune, and I told my teacher, and she asked me to play it for the class, which I did. Well, my class all laughed, as 6-year-olds do, and they started singing my song in the playground at lunchtime. I thought they were mocking me. And I realized that from 6 years old, that one experience had made me profoundly terrified of the opinions of other people when I presented in small groups. Is this the sort of thing that you encounter when you're working with people, whether it's corporate professionals or public speakers? Often it's about getting into the deep past of what happened before you can uncover the confidence that's lurking within.
You're so on the mark with that. And part of what I try to get people to understand is really do a paradigm shift. Because most people, if they think about public speaking or presenting, they put themselves on a performance treadmill. And when you put yourself on that treadmill, you have a tendency to think that it has to be perfect.
Right.
But for you and I, when we chit-chatted on the phone last week or the week before, we didn't think the conversation had to be perfect.
No.
If you and I were going to go to have a cup of coffee or a cold beer or whatever might be appropriate, you and I wouldn't think twice about how we sit down. We wouldn't think twice about what we do with our hands.
Yeah.
We would look at each other because we're having a conversation.
Yeah.
So part of the paradigm shift I try to get people to take is a very simple one. Go from this idea of public speaking to just having a conversation. Now, you can have a conversation in front of 5 people, 15 people, 500 people, or 5,000 people.
Yeah.
Today, what people want is that authenticity. Just be real, be yourself. If I could really write the script, I would make sure that no young person ever said the word public speaking or present.
Yeah.
And I would make sure that in high school or the first 2 years of college, they would have to take this information because I believe it would change everything that they would do and put them on a completely different path for their success.
Absolutely.
As they master the ability to communicate verbally and from a written perspective.
Absolutely. So let's unpack that a little bit, because you mentioned that you've developed a system around how to do public speaking and uncover your confidence. So for the beginners, for somebody who's just starting out and perhaps they don't feel like they've got the skills to communicate confidently, what would you say the steps are or the system is to get there?
Well, with today's technology, probably the best thing that they could do would be get someone to just film them briefly, 90 seconds,
Yeah.
and get what we would call a benchmark.
Okay.
So that they can see what they do.
Great.
Because 9/10 of this is really becoming aware of what you do or you don't do.
Yeah.
From there, then it's implementing some basic foundational. Sir, did I lose you?
No, I'm still here. You're still okay. Carry on.
Okay. There are 3 basic areas you want to focus in on.
Yeah.
The very first one is what we call your physical delivery. You and I would probably call that more body language.
Okay.
Everything from how you stand or how you sit to your gestures, to facial expressions,
Yeah.
to your voice, and to your eye contact.
Okay.
Now, in that particular area, there are 4 skills that I call the power skills.
Okay. Talked about that.
That's your posture,
Yeah.
seated or standing.
Yeah.
That's your eye contact, That's the power of the pause, primarily around getting rid of your ums and ahs, the things that become a distraction in your speech.
Yeah.
And then the ability to communicate concisely, which is more of a short to a medium sentence.
Okay.
Those are the foundational pieces in that delivery block.
Great. So you've got posture. Let's talk about that for just a moment. I'm a big proponent of posture and the way you carry yourself. I do training for school teachers, and one of the things that I talk to them about is the way they walk into a room communicates the level of authority and confidence that they have. And something as simple as standing up straight with your shoulders back has a profound impact on how well people are received. Can you talk about some of the body language that's necessary to communicate confidence as a speaker or even in general conversation if you want to communicate effectively?
Sure. So let me just add to what you said, Tarun, with your posture. Everything I try to do in my classes or my podcasts or anything that, or when I'm coaching,
Yep.
It's to illustrate the principle, and then you have a principle that makes it repeatable. So with your posture, just to add to what you said, here's the principle I typically teach. Posture is the number one skill that communicates confidence before you open your mouth.
Yeah.
To your point, sir, when you walk in with your shoulders back, you're standing tall, even though you haven't said anything, the perception of people is that you are confident.
Yeah.
Now, this idea of perception is critical, because how you perceive yourself and how others perceive you can be totally different.
Yeah.
You want to make sure you close that gap as much as possible. And that concept is what we call disparity.
Right.
Now, the example I might give in class, and maybe, Tarun, you've had this example, where you walk in, you do something, you run a meeting, you give a talk, whatever it may happen to be, and you walk out the door and you go, wow, I really messed that up. And someone comes out the door and says, Tarun, and they grab your hand and they shake it and they go, wow, that was awesome. And you look at them and go, were you in the room that I was in? Because that's not what I experienced.
Yeah.
That's that disparity. And that disparity will kill you every single time.
Right.
So that's that idea around your posture. Now with your eye contact, if you and I were having a cup of coffee, we would look at each other.
Mm-hmm.
But all of a sudden, when someone gets in front of a group of people, let's say there's only 10 people at a boardroom table.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, people are doing what I call eye spray, as compared to just a thought. So here's the principle for your listeners. It's a series of one-on-one conversations. You can only talk to one person at a time. So if I was coaching an executive for a keynote speech, part of my requirements is hopefully we get them in front of an auditorium, a blank auditorium.
Yeah.
And I bring in 25 of these laminated sheets that have silly faces on them. And I paste them all over the room that they're going to be in.
Mm-hmm. Now
they're up on a big stage, but I get them to focus their eye contact to one of those pictures, to one of those pictures, to one of those pictures. Now the audience perceives that keynote speaker, that TED Talk speaker, is really having a conversation with the individuals.
Yeah.
And when someone feels like they're speaking right to you, you win every single time.
That's great. That's great. So posture, eye contact. You talked about the power of the pause. Talk more about that, because I know that was a big revelation for me when I was learning how to do public speaking and get rid of those ums and ahs. Being okay with the awkwardness of the moment of silence. How would you advise people to adopt that principle and implement it effectively?
Well, if you think about what a pause is, sir, a pause is simply, from a spoken communication perspective, punctuation in your spoken speech. That's all a pause is.
Great.
So if you and I were writing a paper, doing some type of a white paper, or we're writing an RFP, whatever it may happen to be, an email, you and I would punctuate it.
Yeah.
What becomes uncomfortable is the silence.
Yeah.
So I want you to think about a very simple timeline: the past, the present, and the future. Think about that, just say across a whiteboard or on a piece of paper. When I am communicating, say for example right now, with the past, the present, and the future, where is my voice or my mouth on those three? Answer that for me.
So where is your voice?
My voice or my mouth, the past, the present, or the future?
Okay, so
It's
it's
in the
always in the
present,
present,
right?
isn't it? Yeah.
Right, it's just right here with you.
Yeah.
Now, tell me, sir, since I'm the communicator, where is my brain?
In the future.
Yes, sir. What am I going to say next? What am I going to say next? What
Yeah.
am I going to say next? The listener is in the past.
Okay.
So the listener is always behind you.
Yes.
We have a tendency to think when we communicate that the communicator and the listener are side by side,
Okay.
almost like dolphins breaking water at the front of a cruise ship. We've all seen that
Yeah.
picture.
Yeah.
But the reality is, I say something, Tarun, you absorb it. You
Yes.
say something, your listeners absorb it. If we don't put that punctuation in our speech, the listener never gets a chance to absorb it.
Great. Great.
The value you bring to the table, the value your listeners bring to the table when they're communicating with their customers or their clients or their family or their friends, what they bring is too valuable to short circuit by not giving their listener an opportunity to absorb it.
Yeah. So good.
Purely that pause gives the listener an opportunity to catch up. And the beauty for you or I as the communicator, in that split second, we get to think what we'd like to say next.
Great. Great. So the thing of letting the listener catch up, I think that's real. I don't want to understate that too much, because I think you're clarifying something for me. It's something that I've had an awareness of, but probably haven't articulated it like you have articulated it, that the listener is in the past, that they're playing catch up. I once heard somebody say that when you speak, that there are three conversations happening: the one in the speaker's head, the one in the listener's head, and the one that's actually coming out or transpiring between the two. And really, the art of communication is finding the bridge between those two conversations. And so really what you're describing here is giving your listener enough time to absorb, process, and to keep up with you, rather than just barrel along assuming that they understand where you're at.
You hit it right on the nose, Tarun. So here is the principle at the very beginning of our 3-day communication program that I drive home. Most people have a goal of, how do I tell them more?
Right.
If you look at the average salesperson, many times it's, I've got a solution, tool, or product. I've got to be able to get all of this out to that executive suite or team that I'm speaking to. So what they end up doing is a data dump.
Yeah.
In my mind, 9 times out of 10, we have a tendency to show up and throw up
Right.
in the information we're trying to share. So I don't think our perspective, I don't care whether it's a one-on-one, it's a small group, or 500, that our goal is, how do we tell them more? I think if we take a perspective of, how do I get them to remember more, it changes everything that we do. It changes the way I craft the presentation. It changes how I craft the speech. It changes how I craft the conversation.
Right.
So for me, and what I'm sharing with your listeners, my goal would be, how do I get them to remember some of these principles that I'm sharing with you, so that they can share them with someone else?
So good.
If someone can listen to your podcast, walk out the door, go down the hallway, see a colleague or a friend, or that next night their spouse, significant other, and say, I was listening to Tarun's podcast and he said this, and repeat it, then you and I win every single time.
It's great. So good. So good. I love the power of a pregnant pause. I'm like you at the moment. I'm converting a number of my live courses to video courses, and I'm just watching back the video footage of some of those courses, noticing the pauses when I've done it well, and I've actually it's almost been like a refresher for myself, because I'm reminded at how important it is to just let a thought hang and not have to fill the space with more words. And I've noticed that even as you speak to me now, and that's something that I think our listeners take away, is if you are communicating via Zoom or, on a YouTube or a podcast or whatever it might be, don't be afraid to leave space.
Well, now you bring up two things, if I may add to what you said, Tarun.
Please.
Number one, we pause for two reasons. We pause for clarity.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is getting rid of your ums and ahs.
Mm-hmm.
And number two, we pause for emphasis.
Mm-hmm.
So think about, since we've got the world is kind of in upheaval on two fronts around COVID and social justice, think about what Martin Luther King in his famous speech said when he said, "I have a dream." And he paused. 250,000 people waited in anticipation of Dr. King, tell us what the dream is.
Yeah.
All he did was pause. That's the power of pausing for emphasis.
Right.
So we really pause for two reasons, depending on what you're trying to communicate. And the second idea that you mentioned so well is giving that listener that opportunity to really catch up.
Yeah.
Pausing is not optional. It's required in our spoken speech. And with Zoom and the technology that we're doing now, I think the principle we have to remember in our Zoom calls, our webcasts, our Microsoft Teams, when we communicate, is a very simple principle. If I have, and I'm going to make up a number here, less than 10 people on my Zoom call, the complexity of my content and the complexity of my sentences can go higher.
Okay.
Because we can banter more, just like you and I are. You could say, "Bart, now give me just a second. What did you mean by that?" But if I have 10, 15, 25, 35, or 45 people on my Zoom call, because I'm doing a large group, then the complexity of my content has to be simpler, because I'm not going to have that interaction and that banter.
Great.
So the key number on our Zoom calls and the way we communicate becomes critical at the complexity of our content and the ability of the complexity of our sentences.
Right.
And that's why I mentioned this idea, Tarun, of a short to a medium sentence.
Okay. Talk more about that.
Most people do more of a medium to a long sentence, and your listener gets lost.
Yeah.
If you have a short to a medium sentence, it's more of a soundbite. When we communicate, the uncomfortableness for you and I is soundbite, soundbite, soundbite. And I'm going to say, Tarun, boy, I sound like I'm talking to a 2-year-old. That's what it feels like to me. But to our listeners, they have the ability to absorb it and even write it down if they so desire.
Yeah.
And then we're winning again.
Great.
If you will study a good news journalist, anyone on BBC, ABC, CBS, Fox News, CNN, a larger broadcasting system, study the journalists.
Okay.
The more the headline, you'll hear soundbite, soundbite, soundbite. They don't give you complex sentences because they know you have to be able to absorb it.
That's great. That's great. Can I push you a little bit on that? Because I find that there's this tension point with pace. With a lot of modern movies and even YouTube content, there is this tendency to have a very quick pace in order to keep the attention of the listener or the audience. I've watched some modern movies and compared the speed of the cuts between scenes, and they don't last more than 5 to 7 seconds, whereas you compare it to an older film from the 70s or 60s, sometimes you can have one scene that goes on for 2, 3, 4 minutes and before there's a cut. And I noticed that with YouTube now and with podcasts, we have the ability to consume content on 1.5 times speed or double speed. I do that myself too. When I'm listening to audiobook, I listen on 1.5 speed. I watch my teenage son. He watches YouTube on double speed. I don't even know how he takes content in, but it seems to be something that many consumers now just want to get the information quickly. And I wonder, as a communicator, how do we strike the balance between pausing and pacing ourselves so the listener can absorb what we're saying, but at the same time not be so slow that they tune out? If they are used to consuming at a very high speed, many times you'll lose your listener if you are too slow. Do you see what I'm saying?
I do, sir, and it's something that I hear in class often. So here's what we confuse. We confuse pausing with this idea that because I pause, the rate of my speech is slow and boring.
Right.
So let's look up what really makes up vocal variety,
Mm-hmm.
and then break it apart here a little bit. There are 5 key pieces to vocal variety. There's the rate that you speak, fast or slow.
Mm-hmm.
There's volume, loud or soft. There's your God-given pitch and tone, just the way your voice sounds.
Great.
There's the power of the pause, and then there's inflection, up and down. If you will study any good communicator, any good keynoter, any speaker throughout all of history, they leverage those 5 pieces in different ways.
Absolutely.
So what we don't want to do is confuse the rate of speech, keeping things enthusiastic, showing energy, showing enthusiasm, picking up that pace. And then when we need to, slowing down to drive a point, show emphasis, or express maybe something more serious or even sad, depending on what we're trying to accomplish. So here's the principle I would share with your listeners. The idea is that we need to change it up every 4 to 6 minutes.
Okay.
Every 4 to 6 minutes, the listener needs things changed up. So let's say I'm teaching one of my 3-day programs. Now, when I kick off the class, Tarun, I typically start seated. I'm having a conversation with the participants in my class. There may be some rapport building. I may ask them simple questions like, what are you anticipating? What are you looking forward to? What are you dreading? And it's a conversation. And when it gets to the place where I am ready to begin what you and I would probably call teaching, then I stand. Purely standing and seating is one of those ideas that you can change it up every 4 to 6 minutes.
Great.
It could be as simple as ask a question, change your PowerPoint slide, get the audience to play a game, raise your hand. It's not complex things.
No.
So we have to keep in mind, how do I keep an audience engaged? Don't want to go too slow, but we don't want to go so fast that they're not getting the nuggets that you want to leave them with.
So good. Yeah, absolutely. That's great. And I see this in the classroom when teachers are communicating with children, and so often the disconnect between what the teacher is trying to do and the engagement of the student has more to do with the communication skills of the teacher rather than the ability of the student to absorb or to pay attention. And so much of what you've said, I know there's some teachers that are tuning into what our interview now, and these principles apply right across the board, not just in a corporate setting, but even in a classroom, even at home when you're talking to your family or your own children. Just that ability to engage and to match your tone with the mood of what you're trying to communicate. So crucial. It's great.
If I could have my way,
Mm-hmm.
I would, I think I mentioned this, every 17 and 18-year-old would get this information. That would be the
Yeah.
first group I'd really try to help. And the second group, to your point, sir, would be our teachers.
Yeah. So true.
Not to try to get through a curriculum, but how do I engage that student, whether I'm talking about math or science or English or history, whatever the topic is, but how do I keep them engaged? So everything that we drive in class and everything that you and I should do from a communication perspective, in my mind, boils up to three very simple goals at kind of a higher level.
Okay, go for it.
Number one, build trust. Number two, build relationship with our listeners.
Yeah.
And number three, build engagement.
Yeah, so good.
Everything that we should do should map to one of those goals or a combination of those goals. To your point, sir, whether it's with my children, with my spouse, my significant other, a group of students, or the corporate world, those three elements should drive everything that we do. But we don't focus on those things. We come back to this idea of how do I tell them more?
Yeah.
And then we completely miss the mark of where we should be.
And then how do I test to make sure they heard what I said or they learned what I wanted them to learn? When I was a school teacher, one of the roles I held just before I stopped school teaching was a behavior advisory teacher. So I dealt with all the kids that were kicked out of the class for misbehavior. And my job was to calm them down and then bring them back into the class and help to restore relationship between them and their teacher. And I would say 80 to 90% of the misbehavior I saw was miscommunication between student and teacher. They've either used tone of voice or a lack of articulation to communicate what they were feeling, and it's resulted in a blow up or a showdown that escalated far more than was necessary. And so you hit it on the head there. If we can learn to express ourselves well for relationship, for trust, then we'll get the engagement that we're actually looking for in the long run.
And I think you just summed it up, and I'm going to bring that even just to our families, with our children, with the people that we love and we care for.
Yeah.
Many men in my class, I will see them a couple years later, 2 or 3 years later, maybe at the same client side or in a conversation. And one of the greatest joys for me is when one of them will walk up and say, you know, Bart, I apply these principles when I'm working with my customers and my clients. But the biggest difference I have seen is when I worked with some of these things with my children and with my own spouse.
It's fantastic.
Just the idea that they look at their children in the eye and have a conversation with them, compared to screaming at them when they're upstairs and they're downstairs, makes a whole world of difference in what we do.
Yeah, it's so powerful and such a good reminder. I mean, I have to remind myself of this with my own spouse and children, even though I teach this to other people. But like you say, one of the most powerful experiences I have in what I do is when my participants say, this is not going to help me with the students I teach, but this is going to help me with my family. And very often, like you describe, you know, they come back and they say, you'll never believe I'm getting along with my own children better because of what we've learned. And so just such transferable skills that apply to such a broad range of areas of life. What would you say to somebody, let's go beyond the basics now. What would you say to somebody who perhaps is a professional speaker or has to present as part of what they do? What are some additional aspects that we need to incorporate or be reminded of when we're presenting for engagement?
Well, if you'll come back to where I was sharing with the three foundational areas to build from, that idea of delivery, the mechanics, where we've spent a fair amount of time.
Yeah.
The other two circles are really around crafting content, your message, whatever that is, whether it's 5 minutes or 50 minutes, and then how do we interact with that audience?
Okay.
Just out of my experience, Tarun, there are not advanced delivery skills.
Yeah.
You're either looking at people or you're not. You're either pausing or you're not. You're either
Yeah.
carrying yourself from your posture, seated or standing correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Where the crafting and the precision and the growth and the pursuit of excellence comes in
Mm-hmm.
is how we now craft our messages and how we interact with our audiences.
Great.
In my mind, this is one of those skill sets that if your perspective is to pursue perfection, we're back on that performance treadmill.
Yeah.
But if our perspective is, how do I pursue excellence? How do I tell that story more effectively? How do I tell that story instead of over the course of a 50-minute keynote in 10 minutes? How do I tell that story in 3 to 5 sentences?
Yeah.
How do I engage that audience not in the first 10 minutes, but in the first 15 seconds? That is a constant pursuit of sharpening that skill set. In my mind, it's a lifelong journey, or at least it's been for me.
Yeah.
It's something that you're constantly trying to get better at.
Yeah.
And just as soon as you feel like I've kind of mastered that, I'm doing better there, then you realize there's another place where you can work again.
Yeah.
It's very much like being an Olympic athlete.
Yeah.
You're constantly honing your skills to a new level.
Absolutely. That's great. So let's unpack that a little bit. So you talk about content and the importance of the story and how you, what you deliver. You used to host a podcast called The Hero's Journey. I understand that it's no longer running, but I suspect you're alluding to the framework that is often used in authoring books and Hollywood movies. There's this concept of the hero's journey, which is the 12 step of storytelling. Can you give us a synopsis, if you like, of the anatomy of a well-constructed story? What are the elements that we need to be aware of to construct our stories well?
True, and if you'll allow me, let me back up 2 steps to lay a foundational piece first, and then I will address that question.
Great, please.
Many people, when they go through my class, they will come out of it, and once they've got their confidence and they feel like they're stronger now, they'll say, okay, now Bart, I really want to go out and talk about my cancer experience. I want to talk about my abuse experience. I want to talk about how I overcame drug addiction or my alcoholism, or I want to talk about, I have an autistic child. I want to help other parents with autistic children. So they find that now that they have their voice, they really begin to pinpoint what they feel like is more their purpose.
Right.
Typically, out of my experience, people find their purpose either from their pain or their passion. Typically, either one of those 2 major buckets.
Right.
So if you think about, say, for example, Princess Diana, out of all her eating struggles, she really found her voice in helping other women get through those kinds of issues. If you will remember Matthew Shepard, for example, the young gay young man who was hung on a fence in Wyoming here in America, his mom started a whole foundation on tolerance and acceptance out of her pain.
Right.
So once you pinpoint that, in my mind, sir, there are 3 major elements that you and I need, entrepreneurs need, executives need, to go from being what I would just call an entrepreneur to what I call a purpose-driven entrepreneur.
Great.
You need to be able to know your core purpose. You need to be able to understand your core whys, what gets you up every day.
Yeah.
And then your core story.
Great.
Now, your core story is your own personal core story. And then if you're working for a company, the company's core story.
Great.
So those 2 major buckets at a corporate level, if you're working for another company, are the 2 main stories that you want to be able to articulate.
So good.
And in my mind, you have to be able to articulate it, as you mentioned, in the hero's journey, all 12 steps or 8 steps, depending if you want to do more of a condensed version.
Yep.
So you need to be able to do that in roughly 35, 40 sentences.
Sure.
You need to be able to do it in 20 sentences. You need to be able to do it in 10. And then if you can really work through it in that idea of 3 to 5,
Yeah.
so that if you were walking down an elevator or walking to an elevator and you said, Bart, tell me what you've got, I could articulate my core purpose or my story briefly, connect it to my solution, tool, or product in less than 90 seconds.
Great.
If I can do that, then I'm winning every single time.
That's great.
So in your story, of course, if you follow the hero's journey, it's just the call, what brought it to your attention, much like me falling flat on my face when I was a kid.
Yeah.
There's overcoming the obstacle, the pain, the fear, the challenge. And then in essence, what did you do to overcome it?
Yeah.
So if you were going to simplify that down to 3 things, those would be the 3 major buckets you can think about.
Okay.
What was the call? What obstacle did you have to overcome? And then how did you overcome it? And then if you could add one more piece of that, what was the lesson you learned?
Great.
That becomes the insight, the power that we share with our listeners.
Yeah. So good.
Many people will look at that hero's journey and they'll say, wow, Bart, that's so complex. And it can be. But if you look at a good movie like Star Wars or Avatar, any of those kind of classic, powerful movies, they live out those 12 steps that you mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. And once you're aware of them, I see them in storytelling all the time now. It's hard to avoid when you watch a movie. You can sort of almost time the movie based on the movements in the script. Donald Miller talks a lot about this. He's an author, and he also talks about the power of storytelling and the hero's journey. But one of the things he talks about is how many communicators and many entrepreneurs and people who sell, they make themselves hero in the story. And the problem is everybody that's listening is trying to see themselves as the hero. And so if you can frame yourself as the guide, you'll actually be able to draw people into your story in a more compelling way. What would you say that that's an element that you've incorporated, or that you would see as being a powerful way to use that?
Absolutely. So, Tarun, here's 2 things that I'll stand on my soapbox and always talk about.
Sure.
Number 1, you want to continue the conversation already in the listener's head.
Yeah.
But if we don't understand our listeners, we end up talking about something and they go, wow, that conversation isn't even in my head. It's much more difficult.
Yeah.
But if I can pick up on the conversation that's already in their head, I already start off on a better foot.
Yeah.
So let me just give a short example of that around New Year's. So as you and I begin to think about New Year's resolutions, 9 times out of 10, we're thinking, okay, I'm going to eat better. I'm going to get in shape. I'm really going to do it this time. So what do we begin to hear on television and on radio? Ads from gyms, athletic organizations. All they're doing is continuing the conversation already in our head.
So true.
And they'll hit it one more time in kind of late spring when you and I are thinking about, okay, I've got to be able to get in my swimsuit. And they'll hit it again because you and I are thinking, I got to get ready for beach weather.
Yeah.
Continuing the conversation already in their head.
Yeah.
So that's principle number 1.
Great.
Principle number 2 is I find that most people, when they walk in a door, have a perspective of, how do I impress you? And if you're trying to impress someone, it's all about what you know.
Yeah.
You and I both know that nobody cares what you know or I know.
No.
But if we walk in at the door of how do I empower my people, and this is where you said, how do I make them the hero? How do I empower them to be the hero? How do I empower them to go out and make the difference they want to make? Yeah. If I empower them, then what I'm really communicating to them is how much I care.
Yeah.
Now here in my mind is where it gets really interesting. If you know how much I care, then you want to know what I know.
Yeah.
But if you don't know how much I care, you could care less about what I know.
Absolutely.
But all of those are those foundational mindset things that make the bigger difference when we go to physically communicate. But if we haven't got the right principles that we're building our foundation from, then we can't launch, no matter how good our delivery is, no matter how great our story is, or no matter how great our ability is to answer a question, interact with an audience. If we don't have that trust, relationship, and engagement happening,
Yeah,
all of that's worth nothing.
absolutely. That's great. One of the things that you mentioned right at the beginning of this conversation was the need for authenticity as a communicator. And I have found time and time again that when I share my stories of failure, they connect with audiences far better than when I share my stories of success or expertise. And one of the things that I notice, I do some speaking in the faith community as well. And one of the things I notice is there is a tendency for leaders to want to share their triumphs or their how-tos on being successful at whatever, fill in the blank problem is in your life. But they don't let anyone know that they've struggled. Um, Talk to me about that sort of balance between exposing your vulnerabilities, but also not being so exposed that you're just bleeding all over your audience, if you like. It's not a therapy session, but at the same time, if you don't have that authenticity, nobody connects with you and nobody feels like they can actually do what you're talking about.
You summed it up well, sir. It's what I call relevant vulnerability.
Yeah.
What is relevant to the audience that I'm communicating with. As long as it's relevant, the story is relevant to them, then if you can be vulnerable enough, to your point, to share your failures and what your struggles, this is where we win.
Yeah.
And if you think about, since you brought up the faith community, Tarun, if we think about stories of Abraham, or we think about stories of Moses, or we think about any of these biblical characters, it was their weakness and their failures where they then had to lean on God and get their strength to overcome them. It wasn't in their successes. It was in their struggle points that you and I, as modern day believers, relate to and can learn the principle out of that story that allows us to overcome our present day challenges and issues that we've got.
Yeah.
But most of us feel like, well, if this is the hole in my armor, if this is my weakness, then you're going to think less of me. What they don't understand is they think more of you.
Yeah, so true.
When you can be that kind of honest with people. I'm sure you know this author, Brené Brown.
Yes. Yeah.
Do you recognize that term?
Yeah.
I enjoy her as an author, and her books on Daring Greatly and Dare to Lead, both of those on relevant vulnerability, I think are tremendous for your listeners. If they haven't looked at those, those might be a valuable resource they could look at.
Yeah. Fantastic. I had a previous guest, Marion Wright, recommended Brené Brown as well. What she talks about for introverts and people who lack confidence in their own ability is very powerful. And I think what you say about that dichotomy where we think that the exposing the chink in our armor is actually going to make people not want to listen or not want to engage with us is actually the exact opposite. That's what's most endearing, I find, even in a story. The most endearing character in a story is the one who's a little bit vulnerable and broken. An interesting thing. It was Jordan Peterson was saying this. He said that in the 1940s, the Superman comic book character had no vulnerabilities. He didn't have kryptonite or anything else. He was impervious to anything. But they found that their audience disengaged and they couldn't connect with Superman because he was completely powerful and not and so they invented kryptonite as a way to engage the audiences because they needed the superhero to have a vulnerability. And that's when Superman really took off and began to amass this enormous following that he has now, is because they introduced a vulnerability to his story.
In my 30 years of really doing this and helping people find their voice, here's just a little something I've learned. There are four types of people. I'm basing on what you talked about in this vulnerability.
Mm.
Group number one are those people who have no desire to understand their purpose. They're going to be born and they're going to die. They're going to go 0 to 60, and that's going to be their life, and they're kind of done.
Yeah.
The second group of people are those people who want to pursue that sense of purpose.
Mm.
But it eludes them. It's something mystical, and it's always something that's out there and it belongs to someone else, and they're never able to find it. The third group of people are those people who pursue their purpose. They find their purpose, but they live in fear.
Right.
They live in fear of, what will people think of me if I do that? What if I fail? What if I can't accomplish that? What will my mom say? What will my parents say? What will my children say? What will my spouse say? They're so worried about the perception of others around them that they never live out that purpose. For such a long time, Tarun, I was in that group, afraid to really live out what I felt like my purpose was. That fourth group of people are those people who seek their purpose, they find their purpose, and then they live out their purpose. And those are the people who are the most successful financially, relationship-wise, wisdom-wise. They're on the path where they give their gift. So here was my point to what you were saying. Our vulnerability, many times, the pain, our obstacles, our challenges, in overcoming them, become the gift, the insight that we share with others. So good. If we only had the strength and the vulnerability to share that, we'd be able to share our gift. And if more people were sharing their life gift, surely the world really has to be a better place.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, what you say there is so powerful, and I think it's a beautiful place to bookend this conversation. But I don't want to escape from this moment without asking you, for somebody who's listening, that perhaps they realize that they have a purpose, but they are struggling to move past that place of fear. What's something that you could say to them that will help to move that needle forward and, help them to overcome those sometimes very crippling and very real fears of vulnerability and failure that hold them back? What was the process you went through, perhaps, and how can our listeners actually latch onto that?
Well, now you've asked a couple of questions there.
I have, sorry.
Well, let me see if I can address your first question.
Okay.
And this may sound like kind of a hard statement, but this is just what I have learned, and I can only speak from my experience.
Yeah.
If you and I, your listeners and my listeners and the people you and I touch, don't share their life gift, in my mind, someone will physically die. The path that you're on, the path that I am on, there are people behind us that are following in that path. And if you and I can offer a way to smooth out that path, clear that path, make that easier for someone by sharing our vulnerability, sharing that struggle, then we're in a really good place.
Right.
So for you and I believe that there are three major roles that we have to fulfill. We have to be a subject matter expert in whatever our field would be. So think about, for example, a woman who's gone through breast cancer. She is a subject matter expert in that area. She has her PhD in life in that area.
Yeah.
Subject matter expert.
Right.
The second role we need to play out is a guru. And what I mean by a guru is just a teacher. Someone just to share what we've learned. Someone to share our experiences. Someone to help someone else not make the same mistakes they've made.
Yeah.
And that third role is that idea of a hero.
Yeah.
And all a hero does is show the way, just
great.
lead the way.
It's great.
So if we go with that principle of saying, here's the idea, if you share your gift, you're really giving life to someone else, that becomes a huge motivator for what we do.
Yeah.
Because 9 times out of 10, people will go, my story will not make a difference. And this is where I will stand up and say, your story will make a big difference. Now, your story may not be something that changes the world, but maybe it changes your neighbor next door.
Yeah.
Maybe it changes a child that you touch. Maybe it changes someone in your own family.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be these big world things.
No.
You never know who's going to cross our path that our story will make a difference in their lives.
Yeah.
But people sell themselves short.
Absolutely.
And part of my purpose and my passion in class, I will look at those 12 participants and say, as far as I'm concerned, guys, from this day forward, I will never let you sell yourself short again.
That's great.
Ever.
Yeah.
Not if you're going to be around me at all. So I think that the answer to the second part of your question was for them to realize that their story, their experience, their travels, their journey makes a difference in someone else's lives. And they can't forget that.
Yeah. When we live our lives beyond ourselves and live it for someone else, it gives a power of motivation that is really quite catalytic in helping us overcome our fear. I mean, I've found that in my own life, in so many of the things that I've had to overcome. My children and my family have been the motivator. You know, I do it because I have to do it. I have to do it for them, because if I don't do it, they suffer. And what you say there is just so true. If we don't share our purpose and our story, somebody dies, somebody following us, somebody looking up to us suffers unnecessarily, because if we don't push through that fear. So what's just one more thing before we close, because I know time is getting away from us, but what's one way that you would say that somebody who's perhaps they are paralyzed by fear, perhaps it's become ingrained habit, it's become something that just drives so much of their decision making, how do you overcome that internal monologue that can hold us back so often?
I'm thinking of my own life now, Tarun. There are still times when I get anxious, I get nervous, and I'm afraid. I don't know that we absolutely overcome it. I think we master it and we control it.
Correct.
Last June, I got asked to give the commencement speech to a group of 5th graders. What do you say to a group of 5th graders? Have a good summer. I'm supposed to be inspiring.
Yeah.
The commencement speaker the year before was some athlete that gave every single one of the graduating students a t-shirt with his number on it. I mean, how am I going to compete with that?
Yeah.
I'm standing in front of these 130 5th graders with 260 parents behind them, all staring at me. I'm wearing kind of a summer khaki suit. True, my palms were perspiring.
Yeah.
I was so afraid I was going to have paw prints on my light colored slacks. But I come back to the principles that we've shared with your listeners. I know that if I demonstrate the skill sets, I know if I look my audience in the eye, if I use a short to medium sentence, if I carry out the power of the pause, if I keep my posture open and confident, even though on the inside, sir, I can still feel that sense of nervousness or fear or angst, I know my listeners don't see it.
That's great.
And as soon as I begin and I focus on the idea of how do I engage those 5th graders? How do I reach those parents? How do I touch that individual?
Mm.
I'm so focused on being with my listeners that my focus isn't on me anymore. It changes everything.
It's fantastic.
So I think it's really learning how to master that
Mm.
fear
Mm.
than it is completely overcome it.
Yeah.
A little bit of angst, I think, keeps us sharp.
Yeah, absolutely.
An athlete would want a little bit of nervous when they're going to go
Mm.
compete.
Mm.
They want to feel that edge. There's nothing wrong with that,
No.
but you'll notice it doesn't control them.
Yeah. No, that's good. It's that whole that old adage of courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite fear. And you really
Yeah.
just you step out and you have a go based on the practice and the work that you've put in prior, and trust that what you've done in the lead up to that is going to carry you through that moment where you feel fearful.
True, and I even have found that sense of anxiousness as we really moved from more face-to-face interaction to using some of these technologies, Zoom
Sure.
and Microsoft Teams and some of these other platforms.
Mm.
My nervousness didn't come with the content I wanted to share.
Mm.
It was, okay, am I going to get my technology to work? That creates another level of angst, just making sure that aspect is
Yeah.
doing what it's supposed to be doing.
So true. So true. But I have thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. And, you know, if I had my way, I would continue talking, but I want to be respectful of your time. And thank you so much for the wisdom you've shared with us today. I have personally found it so empowering, and I hope that our listeners have done the same. Please tell us about the course, the 3-day course that you're developing at the moment. It's something that you have, and before COVID, you presented as a live workshop. You're now going to be converting it to a video online course. Tell us about that course. Is it strategic communication skills? Is that what it's called?
That is correct. It's the foundational program to run that we build from. So I have a press and media class. We have more of an advanced content skills class. I do a program around that core purpose and story that we talked about. But the 3-day program is the foundational piece that we build from.
Great.
And we focus on those 3 major areas: your physical delivery, your content, and your interaction.
Yeah.
We're taking all of that and putting it online.
Great.
One of my goals when I came back from Africa on one of my very first trips, sir, one of the women in my class said she had an orphanage. And I said, if you find any value in what I've done, I will come to your orphanage. 9 months later, I worked with 60 students in Kenya. When I came back from that trip, I asked myself, okay, what do I do now? And I laid out a goal, Tarun, of giving 1 million people their voice.
Great.
My purpose since 2008 has been very, very focused of giving nonprofits, women, young people, entrepreneurs their voice so that they can get out and make a difference in the world.
So good.
Now, exponentially, putting my program online will give them the ability to get that information, even though we can't be face to face.
Yeah.
I want those people that are in remote areas, people that don't have an opportunity to sit face to face with me, can get the skills they need to go out and touch the world the way they see fit.
That's brilliant. And that's launching in July. Is that correct?
We're going to be launching that the end of July. So the program will be available on a platform called Teachable,
Okay.
Tarun, that they'll be able to access that.
Okay.
And I'm launching a brand new podcast called the Remarkability Institute that's going to be focused on 3 major things: on instruction, on insight, and inspiration around the communication skills, and then people who are sharing their stories of how they found their voice and the difference that they're making.
Love it. That's so good. We're going to put a link in the description for how people can access your content. Of course, you've got your website, bartqueen.com. Do you have any other means or ways that people can connect with you, social media that you'd like to highlight for us?
I think through the website is probably the easiest and the most effective if they'd like to touch base. And because I really believe in reaching out to folks, let me give one more email address that they can reach out and connect with me with.
Great.
It's Deb, D-E-B-R, at bartqueen.com. She is my colleague and my assistant. And if they just want to send an email, if they'd like to have a conversation, if any of your listeners would like to have a 15-minute coaching call, Tarun, I'd be more than happy if they want to reach out to Deb. I'd be happy to give them 15 minutes of my time, answer any questions, and help them any way, shape, or form that I can.
That's such a generous offer.
I'd like your listeners to see that I could be a resource in order to help them, since you've been so gracious.
Oh, wonderful. And that's such a generous offer, Bart. Thank you. We will definitely put that email in the description. So if anybody wants to reach out to Bart, have a 15-minute coaching call, do it, because, you know, Bart is a internationally sought after trainer and speaker and coach. And this is just a wonderful opportunity to glean from him and the wisdom that he has. Bart, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk with you today.
And I've enjoyed myself immensely, Tarun. Thank you.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you got a ton of value out of that episode. Don't forget to let us know what you thought in the comments. And if you have a topic you'd like us to cover next time, we'd love to hear from you. If you know anyone that would benefit from the content that we produce, please like and share this channel. And we look forward to having you next time on the Tarun Stevenson Leadership Channel.